My dad and Richard grew up together in the Heights here in Houston, and I had learned of Richard when I was a young boy. Growing up here in Houston and Richard being who he was, and the John Hill murder case all over TV, and I knew that I wanted to practice law when I was about 7 years old, and I never looked back on it. Even after I met Cogdale, I still didn't change my mind.
Still hadn't learned to practice
law. When I was a senior in high school, my dad ran into Haynes at a Reagan High School reunion, and he said, and I want to echo what Jack said, none of us ever called him Racehorse. We all just called him Richard. And the rest of the world called him Racehorse, but to us he was just Richard, and he was kind of laid back like that. When I was a senior, my dad ran into him at a Reagan High School reunion. He said, my son wants to be a lawyer, and he said, send him by, I'll give him a job. And so I started working at Haynes and Fullenwider 2 days after I graduated from high school. In 1979, Jack had just become the office manager when I started there, and so Haynes was in trial out of town, and yeah, frightening. And I walked in to meet this, I don't know what your rank was at the time, but he acted like a general, and scared the you-know-what out of me. But I worked there from '79 until 1993 when I left to start my own practice. I did everything you could do in a law firm except be his partner. I was everything. I started as an office helper. My first day, Don Fullenwider called me into his office and said, are you Chris? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, this library book is late. Would you go make me a copy of it? And I spent all day copying a library book, my first day at a law firm. I was a private investigator, a messenger, a law clerk, and an associate lawyer through all that time. I can't tell you the experience that I got.
Didn't he and your dad host a comedy show?
Well, in the 50s, when they were at U of H, my dad and Richard and a few other guys wrote a show called the Frontier Fiesta, and U of H put it on. It's a week-long festival. And in the 50s, Look magazine wrote it up as the best college week in America, and they actually still do it today at U of H. And my dad got invited, I don't know if Haynes went, but my dad got invited back several years ago as one of the founders, and it was one of the most exciting things for my dad ever. But they started the Frontier Fiesta, my dad and Richard and a few other guys that all grew up in Heights together. Haynes would go to that thing, and he would walk out on the stage. My dad told me this, of course I wasn't there, but my dad told me that Haynes would walk out on stage and interrupt the show, and he'd holler, script, and they'd roll toilet paper down from the rafters, and he'd rip off a few squares, and he'd just start telling jokes. And whoever was in the middle of their act had to stop while Richard did this stand-up comedy. It was an interesting thing that he did, that they did, and to have lasted now for over 50 years is amazing.
Dan, you came into it a little bit differently than these guys. You graduated from college, and I mean, I've heard the story.
Well, I got kicked out.
You can't prove that.
But you almost had I don't know what I don't want to make it sound like you're a sycophant or anything.
Stalking charge.
It was
again, never
stalking.
convicted.
Yeah, right.
Never
I mean,
convicted.
but it was almost like that. I mean, you almost had a rock star worship quality for him before you went to work for him.
The true story, and I don't tell this because, when Haynes was alive, he would have been embarrassed, but the true story is I'd never heard of Richard, and in my third year at South Texas, he stalked me. It was ridiculous. Whatever it takes, I want to hire you. But the first time I ever met Richard or saw Mr. Haynes was at the motocross track in the early 70s, and he was just the old guy at the motocross track. Well, of course, old guy is relative. And he had the new bikes and the new trailers and all that stuff, but he couldn't ride a motorcycle very well. And then I started seeing him on television with the John Hill case and the Blood and Money, and Haynes was an icon. I mean, when Jack went to work for him in the late 70s, I think Texas Monthly did a survey, and Richard had more name recognition than anybody in the state, including President Reagan, except for Tom Landry. I mean, everyone knew who Racehorse Haynes was. Wow. And so I couldn't get a day job after I graduated from college, so I decided to go to law school, and I began law school with the specific purpose of going to work for Mr. Haynes. And I've got to add this because this part's true. I applied as a law clerk, and Jack B. Zimmerperson was the office manager and head of the criminal section, and wisely he did not hire me. But I went to work for Richard after clerking at the Court of Criminal Appeals, and the thing that even after 35 years or whatever, Richard was a great lawyer. There's no question about that. One of the best ever. But he's also a great man,
Yeah.
and we've all known great lawyers. And truth be told, a lot of great lawyers are assholes. They just really are. They're self-absorbed, they're arrogant, they're condescending, they're rude, they're dismissive. And Haynes had swagger, no question about it. He had cachet. You knew you knew he was somebody when he walked in the room if you had no idea who he was. But I never heard him be condescending. Right. I never heard him be rude. I never heard him be arrogant. I never heard him be dismissive. He was, I'm not Jewish, but there's a word called mensch, and he's a lovely man. He's a lovely guy to work for. And as many times as I screwed up, Haynes, the reprimand you would get would be, you could have done it this way, or maybe thinking about doing it that way, as opposed to, Jesus Christ, are you a village idiot? What are you thinking? Right? You learn by example. But he was a lovely man to work for. He really was.
And he was always professional in every setting.
Except when he hired you.
Except when he hired me. In every setting, he was professional. I really rarely saw him in something that I learned that I've tried to employ, except when I'm working with Dan. He never lost his temper. The hardest witness.
No, that's true.
The hardest witness he had, he would always just stay the same and steady and rock solid. And it was a great learning experience for me in cross-examining witnesses to how you stay on top of them without losing your temper. Because I think everybody agree with me, when you lose your temper and you start raising your voice, the jury doesn't hear what you have to say. When you're calm and cool and collected and you're making your points, they're hearing you, and they're hearing the points, and they're hearing the witness screw up and not you.